Now that was an interesting conversation, wasn't it? Well, in this third edition of the Earth, a Culture Fest, since this morning, we've spoken to you about history, storytelling, biographies. And this next one is an amalgamation of all of them of sorts, celebrating 125 years of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's by honouring Netaji and his contribution towards the Asia's independence from colonialism. We would now like to bring to you a talk which is titled as Netaji and the INA's Vital Role in Asia's Rebirth. It is presented by Mr. Prasenjit Basu, who's an author and is well known for writing Asia Reborn, a continent rising from the ravages of colonialism and the war to a new dynamism, and India as a new global leader. Now, let's go ahead and listen to him with his presentation. Here we go.
Namaskar. I'll be talking to you about Netaji Subhash, the INA, and its vital contribution to Asia's rebirth. The story really begins if we think about the fact that we are now approaching the 75th year of India's independence. We really need to understand how we got our independence and whether it was just through ahimsa or non-violence. And the story is much more complex than that. Really, it goes back to the fact that in 1839, two British Indian armies were fighting for the British, one in China and one in Afghanistan. And that begins to tell you that not only Britain's Indian Empire, but all European empires in Asia depended on the British Indian Army for their survival. And so attacking that was always what Indian revolutionaries needed to do. 1857 was, of course, the first war of Indian independence. It was a united war fought primarily by the Marathas in alliance with the remnants of the Mughal Empire. And it came very close to bringing Britain to its knees. Of course, unfortunately, there were betrayals, some from inside the Red Fort itself. Zeenat Mahal, the queen, the younger queen of Bahadur Shah Zafar, was one of those who were providing information to the British, etc. So 1857, 58, 59 was a tremendous uprising, a revolutionary war that came very close to bringing us independence, but in the end, it did not succeed. But the same tactic was what Netaji wanted to do during the Second World War. In the First World War, the Ghadar movement came very close to bringing about a national revolution, a so-called mutiny across all the way from Peshawar to Sonargaon and Chittagong in East Bengal, through to Rangoon and Singapore. That too was infiltrated by the British. The Ghadar rebellion was infiltrated by the British and it was put down. But two veterans of the Ghadar rebellion played a vital role in the formation of the INA. One was Biplabi Raj Bihari Bose, who was really the leader, one of the key leaders of the Ghadar rebellion. He helped found the Indian Independence League in Southeast Asia and in Japan, and Gyani Pritam Singh, who helped found the Indian Independence League in Thailand. So they played an important role. But of course, the problem with the first Indian National Army that was formed immediately after the liberation of the northern parts of what is now Malaysia from British rule by Captain Mohan Singh, who switched from the British side to create the Indian National Army. The key problem for that initial Indian National Army was that Raj Bihari Bose was not a truly national figure. He was a great revolutionary, but he was less well known. He had lived in Japan since 1915, and he was not a national figure. So they needed a national figure, and that national figure turned out to be Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. the last elected leader and president of the Indian National Congress. Remember that in 1938, Netaji was elected Congress president, and he won again in 1939 through an open election. It was quite rare to have an election for the Congress presidency, but he won that election quite decisively, defeating Pattabi Sitaramaiah, who was Gandhiji's candidate to defeat Netaji Subhash. And the key issue on which Netaji and Gandhiji differed in 1939 was on whether or not there should be a civil disobedience movement or other forms of movement to force the British to give India independence in exchange for Indian support for the war that was inevitable. Gandhiji wanted to stay apart from this. Netaji wanted the Congress movement to force the British to give India independence in exchange for India's support in the war effort. Of course, it took Gandhiji 3 years to come around to the same view. On the 8th of August 1942, Gandhiji too gave the Quit India call. But of course, during those 3 years, a lot had happened. But in order to understand this a little bit better, we need to go back all the way to 1907. In 1907, there was a split in the Congress between the so-called moderates and the nationalists. The moderates were really loyalists to the British. They were led by Gopal Krishna Gokhale. The true nationalist forces in the Congress were led by Sri Aurobindo Ghosh and Lokmanya Tilak. And they included Lala Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra Pal, and other great revolutionary leaders who were committed to the full independence or Swaraj of India. In 1907, at the Surat Congress in December 1907, Congress abandoned the path of Swaraj or full independence and instead chose to stay loyal to British rule. That didn't pay off. So in 1928, Netaji, who was then General Secretary of the Congress at the Congress session in Calcutta, or Kolkata, what we now call Kolkata, in 1928, he introduced the Purna Swaraj resolution, asking for full independence as the goal for Congress. Gandhiji at that time was committed only to dominion status for India. And Gandhiji opposed the Purna Swaraj resolution. The Purna Swaraj resolution, interestingly, was moved by Netaji Subhash in partnership with Jawaharlal Nehru. But when it came to a vote in Congress, Jawaharlal and Motilal Nehru voted against Purna Swaraj and delivered victory to Gandhiji. I assume from the evidence that what Jawaharlal got in exchange for his support to Gandhiji, as opposed to his call for Purna Swaraj along with Netaji, was the Congress presidency in 1929. In 1928, the president of Congress was Motilal Nehru. Jawaharlal was the first dynastic succession to the Congress presidency. It was the only dynastic succession to the Congress presidency that occurred before independence. And of course, since independence, we've had many. But the dynasty really began in 1929. Now, the important point is that Netaji Subhash wanted Purna Swaraj, and Gandhiji told Congress that he would deliver dominion status by the end of 1929. If he failed to deliver dominion status by the end of 1929, he would also become a so-called independence wala, or somebody committed also to Purna Swaraj. And since he couldn't deliver dominion status by the end of 1929, Gandhiji took the Congress along, and on the banks of the river Ravi in Lahore on the 26th of January 1930, the Congress finally committed to Purna Swaraj as the goal. That was Netaji's goal, and that became India's and Congress's goal. Of course, Netaji was then sent into exile. He was initially sent to Mandalay in prison in Mandalay in Burma, as was Lokmanya Tilak in 1907, but sent away then into exile when he was ill into Europe. And he helped organize India's independence movement, created a huge support base for it in Europe during his period in exile there, 1934 to 1937. Then, of course, he was soon after winning the Congress presidency for a second time in 1939, he resigned because of differences between him and the so-called Gandhi faction over the issue that I discussed at first, which was the issue of whether or not India should force the British to give India independence before the war in exchange for India's support for the war effort. And when that didn't come through, eventually Netaji was imprisoned again. And of course, he famously escaped from house arrest in Kolkata in January 1941, went to Peshawar, then to Kabul, walked across the Hindu Kush mountains and reached the Soviet Union, and then on to Germany, and began the alliance initially with Germany, but eventually with Japan, through which the Indian National Army was formed. Now, the Indian National Army played a really vital role in two or three things. First of all, the Indian National Army was formed in Singapore in a proper way by Netaji after he arrived in Singapore in July 1943. On the 21st of October 1943, a provisional government of Free India, or Arzi Hukumat-e-Azad Hind, was established at Singapore on the 21st of October 1943, and it came to be recognized almost immediately by 10 different countries around the world, including the neighboring country of Thailand, which was independent, the Philippines, which was then called the Second Republic of the Philippines, the government that ruled most of China, the most developed parts of China that still exist today, the parts that were ruled by a man called Wang Jingwei, who was the leader of the Kuomintang, the left wing of the Kuomintang, had aligned with Japan, while the right wing of the Kuomintang, or the KMT, was led by Chiang Kai-shek. He was based in Chongqing, in what is today Beijing, Shanghai. All the developed parts of China were ruled by Wang Jingwei. The government of Wang Jingwei recognized the Provisional Government of Free India. So most of Free Asia recognized the newly established Provisional Government of Free India as the true government of India. And that government then took charge of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands on the 30th of December 1943. They were renamed the Shahid and Swaraj Islands by Netaji Subhash and the Provisional Government of Free India. And then in February 1944, the Indian National Army, or the Azad Hind Fauj, moved to what is today Yangon or Rangoon in Myanmar, then called Burma, and from there began the assault on the liberation of British India, starting in what is now the area around Mizoram, then called the Chin Hills. The Chin are kin of the Mizos. They live on the Burmese or the Myanmarese side of the border. Anyway, from the Chin Hills began the assault, and the flag of Free India was planted on Moirang, a major town in what is today Manipur, on the 14th of April 1944 by the INA after its victory in the first battles of the war in eastern India. Interestingly, in Moirang, the headquarters of the new Provisional Government of Free India was established at the home of a man called Mairambang Koireng Singh, who was later to become the first elected chief minister when Manipur had its first chief minister. It didn't become a state until a little bit later, but the first elected chief minister in the 1960s was Mairambang Koireng Singh. And Mairambang Koireng Singh was the person who welcomed the INA into his home in Moirang and established the Provisional Government of Free India there. Interestingly, in Nagaland, the Provisional Government of Free India was welcomed by a man called A.Z. Fizo, Angami Fizo. If you look at the history of Nagaland after 1950, A.Z. Fizo became the leader of the Naga secessionist movement. He is the primary leader of the Naga secessionist movement. But in 1944, he was such an Indian patriot that he fought on the side of the Azad Hind Fauj against British rule. One of the reasons why Fizo became a secessionist is because the INA was never given the status of freedom fighters by so-called independent India after August 1947. I'll come to that sad story in a little bit. But the interesting point is that most of Nagaland and Manipur, as well as the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, were freed from British rule and were ruled by an Indian government for at least 3 months in 1944. Unfortunately, that year the monsoons came early. The British forces were aided by the United States Air Force, which had a tremendous number of bombers that cut off the supply lines of the Azad Hind Fauj and its Japanese allies, and they were pushed back from Manipur and Nagaland by July 1944. They fought a heroic battle in what is today Burma or Myanmar at a place called Mount Popa. And all of this story was unknown in India because there was heavy press censorship. And at the same time, in 1943, it's important to understand that in India, there was a horrific famine. And when the famine began, Netaji was in Myanmar. He went to Myanmar and organized a 100,000-ton shipment of rice from Myanmar, which then and now is a major world producer of rice. He organized a shipment of rice to be sent to India in the areas of Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and Madras Presidency that were facing a famine in 1943-44. The British stopped that shipment. So the famine was the second worst Holocaust of the Second World War. It was perpetrated on the innocent civilians of India by Winston Churchill. It's important to understand that when we think about atrocities, the second worst atrocity after the Jewish Holocaust was the Indian Holocaust perpetrated by Winston Churchill on eastern India and the coast of India in 1943-44. Anyway, and Subhash Bose had sent a shipment of rice. It was prevented from reaching the beneficiaries, Indian people. Now, after the war had ended, the British began a trial in November 1945. We know, it's very well known that there was a trial of the INA officers, the 3 senior officers who were captured at Mount Popa in Myanmar. Prem Saigal, Dhillon, and Shahnawaz Khan were tried at the Red Fort. Netaji, of course, had given his Chalo Dilli call, and Chalo Dilli was aimed at raising the flag of India at the Lal Killa. That was not to be, but instead, a trial of his 3 senior-most officers was held at the Lal Killa. And the important thing about the trial was that during the trial, the Indian people heard for the first time about how the INA, the Azad Hind Fauj, had liberated parts of India, had won victories, had established a provisional government of free India that had its own bank and its own currency that was backed by a hoard of gold, the Indian National Army was fully funded by the Indian diaspora of about 1.5 to 2 million people in Southeast Asia, and it did not, and it fought for India's independence. So the fact that this had happened, that Indian troops had fought for India's freedom, had been unknown to Indians before November 1945. It is almost unknown even in our history books today. It is dismissed in one or two paragraphs in the NCERT textbooks that you read about. But the real story is that it was the INA trials that led to the demise of the British Empire in India. Let me show you how it happened. In May 1945, just after Germany had been defeated, the British Armed Forces prepared a white paper, a secret white paper for the British government, talking about what needed to be done to keep full control over India over the next 15 years, that is, until 1960. And what that white paper envisaged was that there would be some modest constitutional changes in India along the lines of the Government of India Act of 1935. If you look at the Government of India Act of 1935, it does not provide for a properly democratically elected Central Assembly. The Central Assembly would have 40% of its seats appointed directly by the loyal kings and maharajas and nawabs who were allies of the British. Only 60% of the seats would be open to an election. And of those 60%, more than one-third of that 60% would be separate electorates for the various minorities. So there was going to be less than 40% of seats that were really open to all voters in India at the time. Now, that was the arrangement that the British were envisaging. They were envisaging small changes to this arrangement, but nothing that would actually result even in dominion status. But unfortunately for them, they miscalculated. When the INA trials began, the prosecutor in the INA trials began to talk about how the INA had fought, how it had created a government, a seditious government that was supposedly trying to remove British rule from India, which is supposed to be sedition, and consequently they wanted to send the three officers to the gallows. They were to be executed. But when the trial began, there was a national upsurge of support for the INA. If you read Maulana Azad's book called India Wins Freedom, he was then the Congress president, he mentions how wherever he went, policemen, soldiers would come up to him and say, "We are with you, get independence for us now." And this was a completely different scenario from anything that had happened before. It was unheard of for soldiers to be talking about India's freedom. But that is exactly what was happening. And so 2 weeks after the trial began, the Punjab governor wrote to Viceroy Wavell saying that it is time to call off the trials because we have already lost Punjab. If we lose Punjab, we'll have no army. 2 days later, the governor of NWFP said the same thing. He said, close the trials now, otherwise we will have no troops to fight for us if there is an insurrection in this country. And so, on the 4th of January 1946, Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief of India, of British Indian troops, he declared that the three soldiers, the three senior generals of the INA who were on trial, would essentially be acquitted. They were given a life sentence. They were not to be executed. They were given a life sentence, but that life sentence was commuted, which meant that they were acquitted. The three officers faced no punishment at all for having risen in rebellion against British rule. They were commissioned officers of the British Indian Army who had chosen to fight against Britain in a war, but they were acquitted. That was the moment when Britain's command over India ended, because Auchinleck then explained to his senior officers, he wrote a letter to all his senior British officers explaining why he had done this. He said, I have spoken to all the senior officers in our army and asked them if we will have their support if we were to face an insurrection in India? And the answer he got was, don't ask us difficult questions. When he asked them, will your men fight with you? Will your men obey your orders to re-establish order in this country if there is a rebellion? He was told there is no chance that the men will obey such orders. So it was clear already that British control over India, which depended on the army's loyalty, was finally ending. Remember, in 1857, Sikh troops, Gurkha troops, fought on the side of the British. In 1915, most of the troops, there were some 68,000 Indian troops who died fighting for the Allies in what is today Iraq, in North Africa, and in Europe. In the Second World War too, 2 million Indian troops had fought on the British side. At the time of the Quit India call from Gandhiji, when Gandhiji gave his Quit India call in August 1942, over the next 5 months, until January 1943, on average, 1 lakh Indians were joining the British Indian Army, Navy and Air Force to fight on the British side. So we are told that Quit India is what got us our independence. Well, if that is the case, why were 500,000 Indians willing to join the British Indian Armed Forces after Gandhiji had given his call to quit India? Most Indians were still happy enough to be loyal to the British to such a degree that they were willing to fight on the British side despite the Quit India call. But in 1946, that changed. Starting around the 15th of January 1946, there was a massive rebellion in the Royal Air Force. All the Royal Air Force units in India began to revolt. The Royal Indian Air Force revolted as well. About 5,000 people who were in the Royal Indian Air Force revolted by the end of January 1946. On the 8th of February 1946, a rebellion began in the HMIS Talwar, which was the main signal ship of the Royal Indian Navy. And this signal ship was rebadged as INNS, Indian National Naval Ship Talwar. And so were 78 of the 88 ships of the Royal Indian Navy. They were rebadged as Indian National Navy ships over the next 10 days. By the 18th of February 1946, there was a massive mutiny across the entire Royal Indian Navy. Wavell asked Attlee, the Prime Minister, to send 3 British battalions to India to help put down the rebellion, because the rebellion had also spread to Jabalpur. The army, the signals regiment of the army based in Jabalpur, and one based in what is then called Madras, now Chennai, had also risen in rebellion. There was basically a national revolt against British rule. It was an armed revolt, remember. It was not ahimsa at all. And in major ports like Bombay, or what is now Mumbai and Karachi, the shore units of the Navy rose as well, and there was massive firing. In Mumbai alone, in Bombay alone, about 250 people were killed in police firing to help put down the rebellion that had become a revolution. On the 19th of February 1946, Prime Minister Attlee, instead of sending 3 battalions to support Wavell, remember in 1919, after the First World War, the British Army had gone into action in what is now the modern country of Turkey, then part of the Ottoman Empire. It had gone to war there to re-establish Allied control over that country. So it was very possible after a war for the forces to come and re-establish order. Instead of sending 3 battalions, what Prime Minister Attlee said on the 19th of February 1946 was a dramatic change. He said that he would be sending three of his senior-most cabinet colleagues, including the Defense Secretary of the United Kingdom, to India to negotiate India's independence. That was the first time any British Prime Minister had ever mentioned the possibility of India's independence. All previous talk had never gone beyond dominion status, and even dominion status was something that no British Prime Minister had ever really spoken of. So, now it is interesting that at that very time, in February 1946, there were Indian troops fighting in what is today Vietnam to help the French regain control of Vietnam. In November 1945, while the INA trials were happening in India, the Maratha and the Dogra regiments were fighting in Indonesia to re-establish Dutch rule over Indonesia against President Sukarno, who had declared the independence of Indonesia. Sukarno was seen as an ally of the Japanese. He was an ally of the Japanese during the Second World War. So the Allied forces, using British Indian Army, were trying to re-establish control. And there was a Battle of Surabaya, which began almost exactly the same time as the INA trials, on the 5th of November 1945. And that day is still commemorated in Indonesia as Hari Pahlawan. Hari is the Malay word for day, not Hari as we know it, but Hari is the word for day. Pahlawan, we understand what Pahlawan is. Well, it's not wrestler, but Pahlawan is the word for hero in Bahasa Indonesia. So, Heroes' Day is the day on which the Battle of Surabaya began. Sadly, the opposing side in the Battle of Surabaya were Indian troops under the command of British officers. Now, all of this is not so well known in India today. It needs to be known, because the real story is that not only control of India, but control of the whole of Asia was dependent on the British Indian Army. So, what did Attlee do on the 19th of February 1946, the day after the RIN mutiny had spread to all 78 of the 88 ships of the Royal Indian Navy and to every one of the shore establishments? Every single port had joined that revolution. So on the 19th of February, he announced the cabinet mission. And to my mind, 19th of February should really be celebrated as Independence Day. That is the day on which the British Empire ended. Now, of course, the British then used the subsequent 18 months to divide Indians and to create a partitioned Indian subcontinent. That is a somewhat sadder story. And it's a story that has many elements that are tragic. But I think it's also worth noting a few things. Among other things, one of the deals that Jawaharlal Nehru made with Mountbatten was not to take the INA soldiers, the INA veterans who had fought for India's independence. He agreed not to take them back into the Indian Army. Not only that, he did not pay them any pensions. No pensions were paid to the INA veterans until 1971-72. This enormous injustice is different from what happened in our neighboring country of Burma, what is then known as Burma, today called Myanmar. In Myanmar, the Burma National Army, which had been trained by the INA, the Burma National Army headquarters in Yangon or Rangoon was next to the INA headquarters. It was a smaller building, much smaller. They were trained by the INA. Burma National Army was taken into the new independent army of Burma. And it was about half and half, Burma Independent Army and half British Burma Army. And they were given full rights. So that was the difference between true and full independence in Burma and this excuse of independence in India. Let me tell you that on 15th August 1947, we did not get Purna Swaraj. We were given dominion status. Dominion status was something that the Congress had abjured on the 26th of January 1930. Yet we took dominion status, and there were two consequences. One was the fact that the INA soldiers were never taken back into the Indian Army. The second consequence was that Britain owed India $5 billion, $5.4 billion in war debts that had been incurred in the Second World War. This was $1 billion more than what Britain owed the United States through the so-called Lend-Lease process. So Britain owed India $5.4 billion. That was never properly repaid. There were lots of complications about how this whole process occurred. But in the end, about 10 years later, India agreed to buy annuities which would be used to pay the pensions of Britishers who had served the British Indian Army or the British Indian Civil Service in India during the period of British rule. So Indian taxpayers were essentially paying the pensions of Britishers who had served in India, who had served the British in India, who had served imperial rule, but India's so-called independent government did not pay the pensions of INA veterans who had fought for our freedom. This horrible injustice needs to be known to all and needs to be addressed as we come to the 75th anniversary of Dominion status, 15th August 2022. Jai Hind.